Hey there YouTube, I'm Forrest Latter-day Skeptic. I recently came across a YouTube video on the channel Veritasium and it blew my mind. It was an intro to a scientific way of understanding the individual benefits of societal cooperation. Of course, I thought this intuitively already, but this is a scientific theory to back up this claim. But first, let me explain why this topic is so important to me. There's a common trope against atheists that goes something like, "You're an atheist? You don't act like an atheist." Or, "You're more Christian than you realize." Or, if God doesn't exist, what's stopping you from taking advantage of people? Because all that exists is power.
So you act as though God exists.
Yep.
And in addition, I've heard you say that I act as though God exists, that I can't really be an atheist.
So far it seems
Yeah,
that.
right, yeah.
We'll see.
The night is young.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I'm not really an atheist. I've heard you say this. So that
Well, some of you is.
well, if I were really an atheist, I would be far more poorly behaved than in fact I am. Right? I would be like Raskolnikov committing murders and assuming there was nothing wrong with it.
It would be more likely, yes.
These very shallow statements assume that our human instincts for cooperation, forgiveness, and love are not rational or natural, but rather they're concepts that we've been given from God or religion. In the past, I've discussed the concept of emergence. This powerful concept helps us understand and explain how we get wetness from hydrogen and oxygen, neither of which are wet. It explains how we can go from minerals in the ground to cities, and it has the potential to explain things like consciousness and morality.
Where does morality come from? Does it come from the benzene molecule, the carbon molecule, the oxygen molecule? In your worldview, where does it come from?
How can a bunch of stupid things do smart things together? This phenomenon is called emergence, and it's one of the most fascinating and mysterious features of our universe. In a nutshell, it describes small things forming bigger things that have different properties than the sum of their parts. Emergence is complexity arising from simplicity.
Through simple processes, more complex structures can emerge that have properties not found in the constituent parts. With this video by Veritasium, I think we found another major tool in the Atheist Toolkit, using game theory to explain social cooperation. So let's dive into the argument. Derek, the host of Veritasium, begins by explaining one of the most famous games in game theory, the prisoner's dilemma.
This is a video about the most famous problem in game theory. Problems of this sort pop up everywhere, from nations locked in conflict to roommates doing the dishes. Even game shows have been based around this concept. Figuring out the best strategy can mean the difference between life and death, war and peace, flourishing and the destruction of the planet. And in the mechanics of this game, we may find the very source of one of the most unexpected phenomena in nature: cooperation.
Keep in mind, when we say game, it's not like some game that we play with our friends. It's a set of rules combined with decision points and rewards. It's used to mirror situations we may encounter in real life to determine the best strategy for dealing with the game that we're in. So here's the prisoner's dilemma.
A banker with a chest full of gold coins invites you and another player to play against each other. You each get two choices. You can cooperate or you can defect. If you both cooperate, you each get 3 coins. If one of you cooperates but the other defects, then the one who defected gets 5 coins and the other gets nothing. And if you both defect, then you each get a coin. The goal of the game is simple: to get as many coins as you can.
This game is found everywhere, from nuclear deterrent strategy to schoolyard kids. Now, think about a time when this game has come up in your life. A version of this game came up the other day for me. My nephews were fighting over candy. If they would have cooperated, they both would have been able to have the candy. But since they started to fight, the younger brother came down and said his older brother had hit him. So the older brother came down and said that it was in self-defense. The result of this is that neither one of them got candy and they both got sent to bed. Here are some other examples of the game. In the original prisoner's dilemma, the rational decision is to defect and not to cooperate.
Suppose your opponent cooperates, then you could also cooperate and get 3 coins. Or you could defect and get 5 coins instead. So you are better off defecting. But what if your opponent defects instead? Well, you could cooperate and get no coins, or you could defect and at least get 1 coin. So no matter what your opponent does, your best option is always to defect. Now, if your opponent is also rational, they will reach the same conclusion and therefore also defect. As a result, when you both act rationally, you both end up in the suboptimal situation, getting 1 coin each, when you could have gotten 3 instead.
But in real life, this game is played over and over and over again. This repetition changes the nature of the game. With this repetition, new strategies are available that more accurately represent our choices in real life.
Well, if they only interact once, then the rational solution is always to defect. That other Impala is never going to help you, so why bother? But the thing about a lot of problems is that they're not a single prisoner's dilemma. Impalas see each other day after day, and the same situation keeps happening over and over again. So that changes the problem. Because instead of playing the prisoner's dilemma just once, you're now playing it many, many times. And if I defect now, then my opponent will know that I defected, and they can use that against me in the future. So what is the best strategy in this repeated game?
Among these strategies, one seems particularly powerful and useful. It's called tit for tat. In the initial iterations of this tournament, it was superior. It's a strategy of cooperation until someone takes advantage of you. Then you match their action.
After all the games were played, the results were tallied up and the leaderboard established.
The crazy thing was that the simplest program ended up winning, a program that came to be called tit for tat.
Tit for tat starts by cooperating, and then it copies exactly what its opponent did in the last move. So it would follow cooperation with cooperation and defection with defection. But only once. If its opponent goes back to cooperating, so does tit for tat.
They then went on to play more tournaments where people tried to beat tit for tat. The result of multiple iterations of this tournament highlighted 4 rules that made for successful strategy. Successful strategies were nice, forgiving, retaliatory, and clear.
Axelrod found that all the best performing strategies, including tit for tat, shared 4 qualities. First, they were all nice, which just means they are not the first to defect. So tit for tat is a nice strategy. It can defect, but only in retaliation. The top 8 strategies were all nice, and even the worst performing nice strategy still far outscored the best performing nasty one. The second important quality was being forgiving. A forgiving strategy is one that can retaliate, but it doesn't hold a grudge. So tit for tat is a forgiving strategy. It retaliates when its opponent defects, but it doesn't let defections from before the last round influence its current decisions. The third is being retaliatory, which means if your opponent defects, strike back immediately. Don't be a pushover. Always cooperate is a total pushover, and so it's very easy to take advantage of. Tit for tat, on the other hand, is very hard to take advantage of. The last quality that Axelrod identified is being clear.
Programs that were too opaque, that were too similar to a random program, you couldn't figure them out because they were so complicated. It was very hard to establish any pattern of trust with a program like that because you couldn't figure out what it was doing.
This is amazing. When playing a game with self-interested players, strategies that had those components were the most successful. However, there is a part of the simulation that skews the result in a way that doesn't mirror reality. How do you know the other person's actions? What if you misread their action or if their action is unclear? To counter this issue, the designers of the tournament added noise to the system. Random instances where a program doesn't respond as it should. This noise caused some major issues for tit for tat.
There was one aspect that his original tournaments didn't cover. What happens if there is a little bit of random error in the game? Some noise in the system. For example, one player tries to cooperate, but it comes across as a defection. Little errors like this happen in the real world all the time. When tit for tat plays against itself in a noisy environment, both start off by cooperating. But if a single cooperation is perceived as a defection, then the other tit for tat retaliates, and it sets off a chain of alternating retaliations. And if another cooperation is perceived as a defection, then the rest of the game is constant mutual defection. Therefore, in the long run, both would only get a third of the points they would get in a perfect environment. Tit for tat goes from performing very well to performing poorly.
So how do you solve this? Well, you need a reliable way to break out of these echo effects. And one way to do this is by playing tit for tat, but with around 10% more forgiveness.
So instead of retaliating after every defection, you only retaliate around 9 out of every 10 times. This helps you break out of those echoes while still being retaliatory enough to not be taken advantage of.
Once noise was added to the system, the original 4 rules weren't as successful. The noise added a level of unknown that can correspond to things like ambiguity, unclear intent, and human error. Once this was taken into account, strategies that were more generous, or in other words, gave their opponent the benefit of the doubt, were more successful than the previous tit-for-tat strategies. Now back to the emergence concept I brought up at the beginning. Although it may seem obvious that cooperation is mutually beneficial, although it's not obvious to some, this experiment also explains how cooperative strategies emerge from self-interested people.
So he ran a simulation where successful strategies in one generation would see their numbers grow, and unsuccessful ones would see their numbers drop. In this simulation, the worst performing strategies quickly shrink and go extinct, while the top performing strategies become more common. Harrington, the only nasty strategy in the top 15, first grew quickly, but then as the strategies it was preying on went extinct, Harrington's numbers also quickly dropped.
This shows a main benefit of this simulation because it tests how well a strategy does with other successful strategies.
After 1,000 generations, the proportions are mostly stable, and only nice strategies survive. Again, tit for tat comes out on top, representing 14.5% of the total population.
Imagine a world that is a really nasty place to live, more or less populated with players that always defect. Except there's a little cluster of tit-for-tat players that live in some kind of nucleus. And they get to play with each other a lot because they're geographically sequestered. They will start building up a lot of points, and also, because that translates into offspring, they'll start to take over the population. So, in fact, Axelrod showed that a little island of cooperation can emerge and spread, and eventually will take over the world, which is fantastic. How can cooperation emerge in a population of players who are self-interested, who are not trying to be good because they're good-hearted? You don't have to be altruistic. You could be looking out for number one for yourself and your own interests, and yet cooperation can still emerge.
So from small groups of cooperative people, like small tribes, a selection pressure emerged that selected for cultures and biology that encouraged cooperation. Over time, these tribes grew until it became a common understanding and ethic that we have today. So here's the beauty of this whole experiment. When conducting the tournament in a way that most accurately mirrored the situations in the real world, repeating games, unknown noise, and survival dynamics, the strategies that were nice, forgiving, retaliatory, clear, and generous won out. In other words, they won out on the individual level, but also as a group. This is amazing, and it helps counter silly ideas like this.
That I think that people who haven't investigated these matters down this particular literary and philosophical pathway never grapple with. Dostoevsky said straightforwardly, if there's no God, so if there's no higher value, let's say, if there's no transcendent value, then you can do whatever you want. And that's the question that he's investigating. And you see, this is why I have such frustration, say, with people like Sam Harris, the sort of radical atheists, because they seem to think that once human beings abandon their grounding in the transcendent, that the plausible way forward is with a kind of purist rationality that automatically attributes to other people equivalent value. It's like, I just don't understand that. They believe that that's the rational pathway. What the hell is irrational about me getting exactly what I want from every one of you whenever I want it at every possible second? Why is that irrational? And how possibly is that more irrational than us cooperating so we can both have a good time of it? I don't understand that.
Jordan, we don't take advantage of our neighbors at every opportunity because it's not beneficial for us to do so in the long run. We have to continually live in these communities, and unsurprisingly, exploitation is not a good way to win a repeating prisoner's dilemma game. And mutual cooperation by selfish individuals leads to a better situation for all of us. This is a new idea that I'm going to add to my worldview. It helps us explain to people why our actions are not Christian actions, why we do in fact act like atheists, why Christianity and theism don't have a monopoly on treating others well, and why it's perfectly reasonable for an atheist to not take advantage of their neighbor. To be honest, I could have answered this question before I saw the Veritasium video. It's not hard to see that if you take advantage of others at every opportunity, you're more than likely going to end up sad, lonely, and maybe even in prison. His inability to answer this relatively simple question just shows that he's willfully ignorant so he can push his religious agenda forward. Anyways, with this prisoner's dilemma strategy, we now have a more scientific basis for understanding the emergence of human cooperation. But not only cooperation, but also the selection pressure for it. Societies that cooperated and genes that encourage cooperation are more likely to be successful. This could explain why we have concepts like love, kinship, loyalty, trust, honor. All of these traits facilitate cooperation amongst us humans. So Jordan, maybe it's more accurate to say, I don't act like a Christian, but you certainly act like an atheist.